Okay, so I guess we'll start, right? Okay, so hello everyone. Good afternoon. Okay, so yeah, it's right. Thank you for joining today's talk, a course sponsored by Weatherhead East Asian Institute and Center for Korean Research. My name is Jungwon Kim. I'm a historian of Chosån Korea, teaching here at Columbia University. Today, I'm very much delighted and honored to have Professor Hyun Suk Park, a leading scholar of Premodern Korean literature and culture, currently teaching at the Department of Asian Languages and Cultures at UCLA. Professor Park's research interests include intersections of literature and music, dance and performance, the history of gender and sexuality, the comparative history of slavery, ritual studies, travel writings, and cultural exchanges in East Asia. She's currently working on her book project titled The Government Courtesan, Status, Gender, and Performance in Late Chosŏn Korea, which examines the music and dance performances in the state rituals and ceremonies by government courtesans. Her recent publication includes debates on abolishing courtesan slavery in Chosŏn Korea, which was published by the Harvard Journal of Asiatic Studies in 2021. And I should say that my entire Chosŏn history class read this article earlier this semester. I'm sure some of my students are eager to ask questions after today's talk. Today, Professor Park will talk about the courtesan culture of Chosŏn Korea, and her talk is titled Government Courtesans in the Northern Military Areas, State Power, Gender Politics, and Literary Culture in Chosån Korea. After her talk, we'll have a Q&A session, so please feel free to type your questions in the chat box during the talk or Q&A, then I'll be moderating the questions. So finally now, please welcome Professor Park.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Professor Kim, for a generous and kind introduction. It's my great pleasure to join this workshop, if virtually, and in the near future, I really want to visit you in person again. So I'd like to start my talk today with a small episode of Chotaeok. So in the 8th day of the first month in 1723, when the Minister of Public Works, Chotaeok, arrived in Uiju in, oh, I'm sorry, but I cannot move my slides. Okay. Now, okay. So when the Minister of Public Works, Chotaeok, arrived in Uiju, in the far northwestern corner of the territory of Chosun, what occupied his mind was not just his official mission of welcoming the envoys from Qing. In the week he awaited the arrival of the Qing envoys, he held a drinking party in his lodging every night. His company consisted of colleagues from Seoul, as well as local officials, including the magistrate of Uiju. Besides enjoying banquets, he went out to watch the town-wide lantern festival celebrating the Buddha's birthday one night. On another day, they went on an excursion to famous pavilion around the town and enjoyed boating on the Amro River. In the works of prose and verse Cho wrote in Uiju, the curious figures of government courtesans, sometimes wearing military garments or riding on horseback, enter the scene elusively from time to time. Courtesans are mentioned in passing as playing the zither, singing on the boat, performing a sword dance, and demonstrating an equestrian game of plucking flags around the ground, mostly through anecdotes such as dancing sleeves, jewels and ornaments, or military garments. As it happened, Cho was not the only official who left some records of courtesans offering martial spectacles in military uniforms in Uiju in the 18th and 19th centuries. Fragmentary references to courtesans in Uiju who are dressed up in military uniform and ride on horseback are repeatedly found in the multiple volumes of the records of Journey to Yanjing, which hints that performances by cross-dressing courtesans were routinely offered to the Chosŏn envoys to Qing passing through Uiju in the late Joseon period. So this is a very famous painting by Shin Yun-bok describing the sword dance by courtesans wearing the military dresses. And this is a picture taken in the early 20th century during the colonial period. A picture of courtesans who dressed up in military dresses for a performance of a sword dance play, which is called the Dance of Hangjang or Hangjangmu. In this talk, I will focus on the martial spectacles of the cross-dressing courtesans offered in Uiju and explore the political, social, and cultural significance of courtesans as state-sponsored troupe of female performers of music and dance. I focus on the particular context of the Joseon envoys' travels to Qing as tributary diplomacy, because I consider courtesan performances as time and place-specific works of performing arts, the meanings and objective force of which are generated in close interactions with their specific temporal and spatial context. In focusing the female performers in their specific socio-political context, my study departs from the existing studies of record of Journey to Yanjing, which is engaged with transnational studies of classical Korean literature, but have broadly focused on the intellectual history of male elites. My study also departs from the existing studies of traditional music and performing arts, which have been more interested in the structural analysis of the aesthetic values of specific works than in the cultural analysis of the performances within the wider political, historical, and cultural context. My study builds upon the small number of exceptional studies that combine the studies of female performers and of cultural practices accompanying tributary diplomacy to provide a case study of the particular formats of courtesan performances. Here, the formats were inextricably bound up with the political practices of the Joseon envoys' visits to Qing, China, and with the cultural features of the local place of the border town Uiju. My reading of the poetry and prose of government officials who visited Uiju in the late Joseon period pays a particular attention to the descriptions of martial spectacles created by courtesans such as the sword dance, archery, horseback riding, which were prominent exclusively in Uiju. By reflecting upon the paradox that the performances in Uiju were emblems of state power, and simultaneously the ingenious cultural products of courtesans, I argue that although the martial spectacles by courtesans were broadly subject to the alienating gaze of male upper status government officials, they often appear to escape the cultural expectations and imaginations of central officials and created the effect of alienating the gazers themselves. In the last section, I explored the extent to which courtesans of Uiju could exercise her own form of agency in examining the case of a courtesan named Nanhe, who in the late 19th century managed to manumit herself and created an alternative life by appropriating the artistic and social skills that she had cultivated as a courtesan. The state involvement in the management of courtesans should be understood in relation to the system of hereditary social status. The population, according to the system's terminology, the population of Joseon was broadly divided into commoners, including Yangban and Yangban aristocratic elite and non-Yangban commoners and base people. Courtesans were categorized as a people of base status, a group that was divided into the privately owned people of base status and the state-owned people of base status. Courtesans belong to the former category along with male and female government slaves, and the latter category, state-owned people of base status, and were defined as government property by law. Right, so this is a picture of the slave register from a village of the Jeolla province in the 18th century. Not all the registers from all the places are remaining, so this is one of the rare materials that shows a list of courtesans. The list shows a courtesan name first, and then the birth name and their age. The government of Chosŏn deployed courtesans in Pyongan province in the northwest on the pretext that the government needed to offer music and dance performances and the rituals for the envoys from Ming, and in Hamgyong province in the northeast because, as I was said, courtesans are needed to attend soldiers who do not have wives. Both ideas had been voiced in the earliest court debates to abolish the courtesan system going back to 1431, and were repeated in numerous following court debates on the topic. Although the king and government officials never disputed that the institution of courtesans went against their own legal, ritual, and moral codes, they also never denied the necessity of a courtesan presence in the two areas. Whenever the government made a serious attempt to abolish the system as a state institution, particularly during the reigns of King Sejong and Jungwon, the two reasons were brought up and ultimately used as a rationale for maintaining the courtesan system as a temporary measure until they find an alternative until an alternative could be found. The controversy notwithstanding, King Sejong issued an edict in 1436 that government courtesans should be deployed in the northeastern military area, saying Jungwon, Hwaryong, Gyeongsang in Hamgyong province are the major garrisons of the province that are at the northernmost frontiers. In his words, quote, "The soldiers who serve there are a long distance from home and spend 2 nights and winters without wives there. They also must have difficulties with petty things in everyday life. It seems reasonable to deploy courtesans and let them attend on the soldiers." 3 years later, the king also acted on the suggestions from the Ministry of Rights that because Yongbyon is the major garrison, here in Pyongan province, we should place 60 courtesans there. In the king's words, the edict do not explicitly state that courtesans were supposed to provide sexual services to soldiers. However, it is unquestionable that courtesans were misappropriated for sexual purposes by Joseon and Ming-Qing envoys, civil and military officials, and soldiers stationed in the northern border areas, as is testified by many sources, such as the veritable records, the records of journey to Yanjing, diaries, travel writings, and poetry. The Joseon government thus ended up maintaining the dual system, in which officially courtesans were deployed in military border area to offer music and dance performances to foreign envoys in government events, and to perform domestic chores for soldiers conscripted without their families. But in practice, they were routinely expected to provide sexual, emotional, social company for government officials of Joseon. The record on courtesans in military camp in Hamgyong province are relatively scarce. So this is a gazetteer of the northern towns, showing the parts of the town called Gyeongsang, the garrison, and the number of courtesans are marked. Like the garrison courtesan 62, and the mobile garrison courtesans 210, and the courtesans in the office of the magistrate like 55. But some extant diaries of military officers from the 17th and 19th centuries, such as the diary in the north, 부북일기, and the diary of 노상추, provides a glimpse on how military officers dispatched from the central government to garrisons interacted with courtesans in local places. The authors of the diary, who mention a number of courtesans, do not appear to clearly distinguish between government courtesans and female government slaves. The latter both attended to the everyday matters of military officers by doing cooking, laundry, and needlework. At the same time, these two writers had no qualms about sleeping with courtesans, female government slaves, and even private female slaves while traveling from and to Seoul or while staying in garrison. So this is some pages from 부북일기, showing that this man spent the night with the household female slave called 통진아. And a few days later, he happened to be staying with a private household female slave called Puni here. And in the next day, they also stayed with the girls called Chutang here. And it is not clear, but it seems indicate the female slaves, government female slaves in charge of serving wine to the guest. And a few days later, they also spent the night with a courtesan, a girl clearly called courtesan. And 노상추 in his diary, in fact, mentions that he had an extended relation with one particular courtesan and seems to have had a child. When he returned to Seoul 2 years later, however, he did not even consider bringing them along with him. The courtesan in Uju, in comparison, were differentiated from their cohorts in other border towns in that they developed and offered a whole series of martial performances to visiting envoys and officials, records of which he made it into many works of prose and poetry. These specific courtesans seems to have been in a paradoxical situation in that they were bound to the inescapable and disgraceful missions mandated by the state on the basis of their inherited social status, yet could still exercise the art of living in Bourdieu's words to some extent because of the particular local features of Uju. Because it was a remote border town, the majority of its population consisted of soldiers and military officers conscripted from their hometowns who were garrisoned there without their families for years. And in addition, the presence of the dominant local Yangban literati was not prominent. The administrative functions of Uju, for the most part, consisted of receiving and sending off the Ming, Qing, and Joseon envoys, which entailed the provision and care of hundreds of horses. The Uju area also seems to have been culturally influenced by the horseback riding nomads from the other side of the border. The visiting officers to Uju perceived the courtesans on horseback as emblematic of the conspicuous and idiosyncratic local culture, which was related to the features of the border town, as in between two different cultures and as being prosperous due to the legal and illegal trades across the border. The observers regarded courtesans wearing luxurious dresses and ornaments, speaking some different languages and showcasing the skills of martial arts as epitomizing the peculiar, foreign, and undecipherable local culture. To the envoys from the different cultural sphere of Seoul, the performances of martial arts by cross-dressing courtesans often appear to slip out of the grasp of the dominant Confucian values, the hierarchical distinctions of gender and social status, and the dehumanizing power of state slavery. Well, the courtesans of Uju wearing military garments are first mentioned in records from the early 18th century. Descriptions of their singing, dancing, and demonstration of martial arts are usually interwoven with the broader social practices of the visiting officials' excursions in the areas around Uju. The aforementioned Cho Tae-ok describes his excursion in 1723 as follows. We found a day to go on an excursion to the Tonggun Pavilion. We then climbed up to the Guryong Pavilion and finally went boating on the Amrok River. Our boats were divided along both sides of the river and cast nets to catch fish. While the sounds of pipes and drums reverberated into the sky, the jewels and ornaments of the courtesans dazzled our eyes. The songs accompanied by the zither and the dances with swords were all mixed together and uproarious. Taking pleasure in drinking wine and reciting poetry, we did not feel tired until the evening. When the sun was setting in the west, we left the boat and went on land. Then we had all the courtesans wear military garments and gallop on horseback. They planted 2 flags on the ground and competed to pluck them up. Being elated with a triumphant air, they truly looked like the child of Yoyen, who had shot an eagle. We all got drunk and became extremely delighted. Cho cherished his memory. This map of the 18th century shows the town of Uju, marking Tonggunjeong here, a tall building on the town wall. And it shows Guryongjeong here again, and then Amrok River. And this is a territory of Qing, China. The map of the 19th century also shows Tonggunjeong and Guryongyeon here, and then Amrok River. Well, Cho cherished his memory of the day and hired a painter to make an album combining the poems he composed with his colleagues on the spot and paintings depicting the major events of their excursions. Oh, I wanted to show the video footage showing the landscape of Uju from the Chinese side today. So this is a river all the envoys to Ming and Qing had to cross. And this is the Tonggun Pavilion up on the hill, where the visiting officials often had a banquet with courtesans. And this is a painting of the 18th century of Tonggun Pavilion. All right. And for the event that Cho and his cohorts remember as a pleasant outing, the courtesans are mobilized by the magistrate to entertain the visitors. In this description, Cho reduces their presence to objects such as pipes and drums and jewels and ornaments. The courtesans were human performers, but were also perceived as musical instruments and ornaments, simultaneously persons and things to the officials. The cross-dressing performances were also offered at the behest of the officials, which makes it clear that the officials and the courtesans were in an asymmetrical power relation. At the same time, in Cho's description, the courtesans appear to be not just objects on display, but also performers of song and dance. It might not suffice to define the excursion as an occasion in which the relation of unilateral domination and submission presides. The excursion rather appears to be the context of multi-directional social interactions in which not only the courtesans, but also the officials act their parts. The courtesans' music is reciprocated by the officials' composition and recitation of poetry. The courtesans are not simply set on the distant stage to be gazed at by their audience, but comprise the interactive cultural practice creating an ensemble of music and poetry in the specific context of a collective excursion in an undifferentiated open space. While the ensemble was being performed, the dynamic cultural practices of the courtesans break through the restrictive linguistic practice that reduced them to the inanimate objects of musical instruments or ornamental jewelry. The hierarchical distinction between the observers and the observed is momentarily renegotiated. Joel left a number of poems that responded to courtesan performances on the spot in the days of his excursion. In one such poem, the courtesans do not remain as the objects of representation, but stand behind the poem as the initiator of poetry composition. They are still designated as things through synecdoches such as singing throat or dancing sleeves. However, they are not inanimate, separate, and captured, but sing, move, and speak back to the poet. The poem thus posits itself as a spontaneous response to the courtesans' songs and dances that are speaking to the poetic speaker, a response that inserts itself in the multi-genre and multi-participant ensemble of performances via affective connections in the dialogic mode. The poem Joel composed in response to the equestrian show focuses on the mode of courtesans playing the game and indicates again the unbridgeable gap between the linguistic representation and the objects of representation, namely the performers. Courtesans are dressed up in military uniforms, having changed their dance dresses. The excellent horses on which they come out gallop as if they were flying. Looking back at the broad field, the courtesans appear heroic and valorous. After plucking the pole of a red flag, they return triumphantly. The poem certainly reflects the hierarchical setting in which government courtesans serve as entertainment for government officials, and it assumes the viewpoints of the observer who wields power in gazing upon the movements of female bodies for pleasure. At the same time, the poem appears to lose some of its control over its objects because of the object's overwhelming otherness, swift and continuous movements, and refined physical skills. The poem captures the courtesans only through their surface appearances, the wearing of military dress, and the exercising of equestrian skills, which it brings up but does not pierce through to the inside to interpret their implications. The appearances of courtesans are presented as an unconventional, enigmatic, and unreadable objects of poetic gaze. The poem also hints on the untranslatable differences from the standpoint of genre between the official's linguistic performances of poetry and the courtesan's bodily performances. The courtesans appear to evade the control of poetic gaze primarily because of their swift and sophisticated physical movement. When the poem describes the courtesans on horseback galloping in a broad field, it sketches their silhouettes, which shows their shapes, but simultaneously implies that it cannot access the minute details composing the liveliness of their movements in the equestrian game, such as their physical force, their kinetic movements, their somatic senses, and their affective modes. Through the double move of providing the silhouette, but acknowledging the inaccessible details that are missing, the poem implies that the bodily movements of courtesans on horseback are tantalizingly unrepresentable. It thereby paradoxically points to the agency of courtesans whose physical power, skills, and speed cannot be thoroughly grasped by the gaze of the poetic speaker. The courtesans are also described as being immersed in the separate field of collective emotions shared by their colleagues, which is not necessarily dominated by their relation with the poetic gazer. The courtesans shown as marching on horseback in the mood of being heroic and valorous or triumphant do not exist in the poem to supplement the emotions of the poetic power and the poetic speaker himself, as is the case with typical poems written during banquets with courtesans that make use of the conventional synecdoches. The poetic speaker of this work is rather positioned as a detached and awestruck observer who is watching objects that he can neither comment nor decipher. He imagines the courtesans as being connected not so much to himself, the poet, the poetic observer, but to their colleagues as they move and laugh together. The equestrian show in the simple form seems to have developed into a show of a pseudo-military inspection on a larger scale at a certain point in the late 18th century. The equestrian show of courtesans at Baekiryeon, a military training ground, was the event in which courtesans in military uniforms were shown in the most spectacular way to Chosŏn envoys and other government officials. Lee Hae-eung describes the event in a detailed introduction to his poem he wrote in 1803. On one day, we went out, we went on an outing to Baekiryeon, which stands outside of the west gate of Uju Wall. The building itself is not so spacious, but its yard is flat and wide, enough to be used as a place for horseback riding and archery. First of all, some of military officers exhibited acrobatic feats on horseback. Afterwards, they selected 5 or 6 courtesans, among others who were good at horseback riding, and then had them wear military uniforms and gallop horses. The horses were all bridled and had a commanding presence. But once a soldier in front of the podium blew a whistle, all courtesans rushed forward, beating the saddles. It was as if they were storming the battlefield. The gossamer figures in red skirts are wearing military uniforms. At the beat of a drum in the military camp gate, the ladies rush forward. The horses are swift and the ladies light, but they are not scared at all. They just move their elegant hands to swing flower-patterned spears. The poem captures the ladies in military uniforms showing off their equestrian and military skills as objects of curiosity. Although the author does not probe into the origins or significance of the show any further, he still appears conscious of the extraordinary nature of the performance. The ladies catch the attention of the audience mainly because they visibly disturb social hierarchies and norms in multiple senses. First, the poetic speaker of the work draws the contrast between the elegant and subtle bodies of the courtesans and their military skills and physical powers. As many studies of cross-dressing practices in different cultures point out, feminine bodies in hyper-masculine military garments destabilize the gender division by revealing that the properties associated with gender are not fixed but alterable. In a particular context of the garrison, furthermore, the equestrian show temporarily subverts the hierarchy between soldiers and courtesans, between those who served and those who served, by inserting the courtesans in the place of the soldiers. The ladies, imitating the military practices of soldiers, visibly render the military power of the army artificial, superficial, and theatrical, eroding the political significance of militant, masculine, and violent power of the army. The show also escapes a grasp of the power relation between the gazer and the gazed. The poetic speaker of the work above retains a power to fragment, objectify, and impoverish the represented bodies of courtesans by drawing upon synecdoches such as gossamer figures and elegant hands, but he also appears alienated from the show unfolding before him instead of being involved in a dialoguing mode of communication with the performers. In this situation, where the described performers enact an utterly foreign and undecipherable space, a scene with overwhelming force and speed, the poetic speaker is left awestruck and at a distance from the ladies riding on horseback, unable to interact with the performance, let alone issue a command. He stands in a situation subtly differentiated from the typical situation in which a scholar official recites a poem in response to a courtesan song, where the poem comprises a reciprocal co-production by an ensemble of poems and design and singers. The equestrian show lastly disturbs the hierarchy between the state and its subjects by theatricalizing the military inspection. There should be an event manifesting absolute royal authority and state power. In the 19th century, the military camp stationed along state borders seems to have lost their sense of urgency regarding state defense. Kim Jong-jung commented in 1791 that the entertainment culture around Uju was so vibrant that it was hard for him to remember that he was in a military camp town. The military inspection, which had long since lost its gravity, had been transformed into an entertainment and was even parodied as the courtesans replaced actual soldiers by playing the roles of women pseudo-soldiers. The observers of the pseudo-military inspection, such as the governor, the military inspector, and the envoys, no longer retained their authority to control the military or the women troop as commanders, but were reduced to being bystanding strangers at the show. The courtesans were certainly caught up in the hierarchical power relations imposed by the state, yet appears to have been active in finding ways out. Written records of courtesans who escaped from their positions are rare, but the daily records of the journey to Yanjing contains a detailed story of one courtesan of Uju who managed to manumit herself and led a life of her own choosing. The unidentified author of the daily record stayed in Uju on his way back from Qing in 1889 and happened to have a conversation with a courtesan, Kumsim. The author asked if he can meet the famous girl riding on horseback in private. Kumsim answers that the girl, who is called Nanhe, 23 years old, removed herself from the courtesan register a long time ago, and that she would not be brought to him even if they threatened her. The author continues to beg Kumsim to arrange a meeting with Nanhe, and finally Kumsim agrees to do so. The next morning, Kumsim brings Nanhe to Baegiron, where the author is waiting. Nanhe, who turns out to be extremely courteous, says that it is because of nothing but her personal admiration for the author that she came to the meeting. After some polite conversation, she offers to present her dance to the author. She threw her body up to ride on horseback. Then she pulled on the reins and kicked with the golden stirrups. Exclaiming in a beautiful voice, she spurred the horse and started dancing with swords. She showed off her martial prowess while showing a variety of different motions. Her swords clanked above and below and thrust to the right and left. It was as if a phoenix had raised its head to guard the front, and as if a nightingale had turned its body around to cover the rear. She spun like a divine dragon playing with the magical beat. She pounced like a fierce tiger coming out of the valley. Whistling winds around from the colored sleeves and glittering lights flashed upon the military uniform. In terms of format, the sword dance on horseback that Nanhe performs here might be similar to the show that other courtesans typically presented to government officials. Yet, the social meanings of the dance have changed dramatically. The dance performance in this setting does not serve to celebrate royal authority or to entertain state bureaucrats. It is offered only for the private enjoyment and appreciation of the performer and an audience of one without mediation of political power. The performer, Nanhe, in this situation is also fairly individuated. She is not an anonymous member of a troupe obligated to perform for a group of unidentified officials. She performs out of her personal respect for a particular person. Her dance is also appreciated as expressive of the genuine talents and skills she alone possesses. She, in that sense, stands out as an irreplaceable, authentic being. After the dance, Nanhe graciously invites the author and Kumsim to her house in the neighborhood. In her beautiful house, Nanhe introduces her 30-year-old husband, Ryu Ha-won, who he says is a literatus without a government position. The author writes that the Ryus have been living in Uju for 3 generations and have accumulated a substantial amount of wealth, which made it possible for Ryu to lead a life immersed in books and music. After being treated to refined tea, the author is led to the private rear garden called Sorangwon. The author describes how the garden is tended with the utmost care and aesthetic taste. While he's sitting in a small pavilion within the garden, Suha, another friend of Nanhe, who is also a former courtesan, but now living with her husband as a commoner, joins them. There, the author is treated to a dance performance by both Nanhe and Suha. After a while, a group of boys came in with drums, flutes, pipes, and the likes. Student Ru poured a drink in a jade glass and had the 2 girls, Nanhe and Suha, offer the glass to me and sing while serving me. Then the 2 girls stood up and danced. Their dance was called the Dedication of the Immortals Pitch at the Jade Pond, which was an extraordinary number. In the meanwhile, all the boys devoted their talents to make the 5 sounds run extremely fast, as if the 2 cranes in the garden were harmonizing with one another, or flying and dancing together. I praised them over and over, saying, "How strange, how odd. This is definitely the dedication of the Immortals' pitch." The author's astonishment at this scene is not without reason, because this work was usually included in the typical court performances at the royal palace in Seoul, and dramatizes a narrative in which a female immortal comes down from the other world to the royal palace and dedicates an auspicious pitch to the king, praying for his immortality. When the performance was presented at the royal court, it had a clear political purpose of legitimizing and reinforcing royal sovereignty. So this is the illustration from the court documents describing or the manuals of court performances. And I just wanted to show a very short video clips how the National Institute of Classical Music reconstructed the work today. Right. So in comparison, the same work performed in the private garden of Nanhe was dislocated both geographically and socially. Being disconnected from any political and social context, the performance is singularized and recontextualized by Nanhe and Suha in their own private lives. In this private setting, the original lyrics of the performance that celebrate the auspiciousness of kingship might have lost the force of meaning, and the bodily movements might thus become the major source of the performer's pleasure. The relationship between Nanhe and Ryu is also noteworthy. Whereas in Joseon society, courtesans had typically become a member of a household by being made a concubine of an old married man of high rank, Nanhe appears to be the legitimate wife of Ryu and to maintain an egalitarian relationship with him. They appear to be relatively free from the norms of gender distinction as they intermingle with male and female friends and guests while enjoying food, music, dance, and the sceneries at the banquet in their own garden. Their social life seems to largely involve spending time with Nanhe's friends. Most importantly, the very situation in which Nanhe, a married woman, invites the male author as their own guest to her house and has her husband entertain him is unimaginable in the case of an ordinary aristocratic Yangban family. Such a situation seems reasonable because Nanhe was a courtesan previously. While she is no longer a courtesan, she seems to have retained some aspects of her former life to her own advantage, namely her capability of socializing with men, as well as her skill in music and dance. Another point that deserves our attention is that Nanhe's case appears to be strongly marked by contingency. She appears to be located in a border area that is relatively free from the dominant social and gender hierarchies of Chosun society. It seems to have been up to luck that she met Yu, who shared her cultural and artistic taste and was willing and able to manumit her. It is not explained how she was able to remove her name from the courtesan register. The Great Code of Administration stipulates that a government official above the second degree could manumit his own concubine of either public or private slave origin by substituting for her another of his female slave of a similar age, as long as his concubine had given birth to his child. Considering that Nanhe was a teenager and childless when she married Ryu, and that Ryu did not have any position in the government, however, we cannot assume that Ryu manumitted her through such a legal channel. We can only speculate that he could have made a certain amount of payment to the government office in order to erase her name from the courtesan register and marry her, which was not entirely legitimate. The exact process of Nanhe's manumation remains murky, and we have no way of knowing if Nanhe's path to freedom could be followed by another courtesan. It remains as a possibility that could be realized only when all the contingencies allowed. Being refined as human property owned by government, the courtesans were placed in an extremely precarious position, replete with many unpredictable dangers and possibilities. Having been thrown in that situation, I speculate Nanhe had to be creative in seizing the opportunity to manumit herself through finding the right partner. She could have been persistent in closely observing her surroundings, learned through trial and error, and tried to manipulate many related people from multiple angles. Her success does not seem to be the result of pre-planned, coherent, and consistent resistance to the unilaterally oppressive power structure. It rather seems to be that she was able to change her life through her artistic improvisational orchestration of both legal and illegal resources available in her given situation. Just like a sword dance on horseback, she seems to have performed a kind of dance with the damaged, precarious life given to her and transformed her life ingeniously and gradually without ceasing to perform all at once. The courtesans riding on horseback might not have been so far away from taking direct actions to bring down the existing hierarchical social structures in the end. It is certainly no coincidence that in modern Korea, the woman who demonstratively modernized herself by cutting her hair short earlier than any other woman, attended a modern male school dressed in male garments, and even went to Tokyo and Shanghai to continue to study, was a courtesan named Kang Hyang-nan. Within a few decades after Nanhe's story was recorded by an anonymous author, the courtesan came to be widely seen as emblematic of modernization in the mass media of colonial modern Korea in both positive and negative senses. The courtesans who came to be redefined as commercial entertainers and sex workers in modern Korea were also one of the first female groups of laborers who went on strike collectively in major Korean cities in the 1920s and 30s, opening the first chapter of the women's labor movement in modern Korea. More investigation needs to be done on how the modern courtesans appropriated the possibilities embedded within the contradictions of the traditional courtesan system in order to modernize themselves and to create profitable and productive conditions of life for themselves, even if their attempts were not always successful. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much for such a rich talk, providing with a rare glimpse into the cultural analysis of the courtesans of the northern region and their performance in the wider political and historical context. So now I'll